General Hospital Spoilers reveal that the walls of Port Charles were closing in as the storm that had been quietly building behind closed doors finally erupted into full-blown catastrophe. In the beginning, there were whispers, strange sightings, and unease in the air, shadows that didn't belong. But no one could have predicted the moment those whispers would become screams. When peace would shatter in a single breath and the fragile hope Sasha Gilmore had built around her newborn daughter Daisy would crumble into horror. Daisy was gone. Stolen. Vanished without warning. And in the cruel twist of fate that followed, it became devastatingly clear that this was no accident. This wasn't a tragedy born from chance. It was the result of one of the most dangerous recalibrations Port Charles had seen in years, a new adjustment of power, manipulation, and madness spiraling out of control. At the epicenter of this unraveling nightmare stood a name no one expected to hear again, Gladys Corbin. The disgraced mother-in-law who had once bled Sasha dry, who had sedated her, committed her, and gambled away her life savings. She had been banished, discarded like a mistake that could finally be forgotten. Sonny Corinthos himself had sent her away, warning her never to return. Not if she valued her life. And for a time, it seemed she had listened. Her name faded from conversations. Her presence disappeared. Port Charles began to breathe again. But monsters don't always stay buried, and some debts, especially those born of addiction and greed, have a way of resurrecting demons. Gladys had returned. Not quietly. Not with remorse. But with a plan so chilling, so calculated, it revealed just how far gone she truly was. She had watched from the shadows as Sasha rebuilt her life. She had seen the birth announcements, the photos. The joy Sasha dared to feel again after years of loss and trauma. And in Daisy, she saw not a child, but a lifeline. A living, breathing ticket out of the wreckage she'd made of her own existence. A new heir, carrying the Corinthos name, connected to a powerful legacy of money, influence, and vengeance. To Gladys, Daisy was no longer Sasha's redemption, she was her own salvation. The moment came without warning. A late afternoon sun filtered through the trees around the Courtemain estate as Sasha stepped inside for only a few seconds, barely enough time to pour a glass of water, answer a phone call, check on something in the nursery. But when she returned to the stroller parked on the porch, everything changed. Daisy was gone. The pink blanket still fluttered in the breeze. The toy giraffe she loved clutched against the side of the carriage. But the baby, the heart of Sasha's fragile world, had disappeared without a sound. And with her, Sasha's sanity began to unravel. The authorities were called. Alarms sounded. Search parties mobilized. And somewhere in the chaos, Sonny Corinthos, Michael's father, Sasha's silent protector, and the man who had once believed Gladys capable of redemption, received a call that turned his blood cold. A witness. A flash of red hair. A woman seen near the perimeter fence. Ducking into a dark sedan, clutching something wrapped tightly in a pink blanket. The make and model matched one Sonny had paid for years ago, back when he was still trying to buy Gladys's loyalty. And in that moment, Sonny knew. He didn't need confirmation. He didn't need proof. He had seen the devil's handiwork before. And this? This was personal. The explosion inside him was instant and silent. No shouting. No threats. Just a stillness so cold it burned. Sonny had let Gladys walk away once. He had shown mercy. And now, she had returned to steal from him the one thing he would never forgive anyone for taking, his family. His granddaughter. Daisy. But this wasn't just a kidnapping. This was the apex of a long-building adjustment in power, emotion, and obsession, one that had infected everyone from Sasha to Michael to Tracy. The battle lines in Port Charles had already been shifting. Drew had fallen from grace. Nina's crimes were inching closer to the surface. Michael was teetering on the edge of becoming someone unrecognizable. Tracy had manipulated the board into chaos. And now, with Daisy gone, it felt as though the entire town had been pushed off a cliff. Gladys's return wasn't just a betrayal. It was a detonator. Proof that no amount of exile or exposure could stop someone so consumed by their own greed and desperation. And more terrifying still, no one knew what she wanted. Was it ransom? Revenge? A twisted attempt to rebuild the power she once had over Sasha? Or was it something even darker, an escape plan that involved disappearing with the baby forever? The possibilities were horrifying. The clock was ticking. And while the police conducted their standard protocol, roadblocks, Amber Alerts, neighborhood canvassing, Sonny wasn't waiting for due process. This was his family. His rules. His war. And as he mobilized his private network, calling in favors from allies with questionable pasts, he made one vow that echoed louder than any police siren: he would bring Daisy home. No matter what it took. No matter who got in the way. And if Gladys was still breathing by the time he found her, it would be because he chose to let her. Sasha, meanwhile, had collapsed into despair. The progress she had made, the therapy, the peace, the slow healing, had been ripped away. Her daughter, her miracle, was gone. And the one person she thought she would never have to fear again had returned to destroy her all over again. Her screams echoed through the halls of the mansion. Her grief was primal, bottomless. She refused to eat, refused to sleep. And when Michael tried to offer comfort, she begged him to do what Sonny would not, end Gladys, once and for all. Even Monica, hardened by decades of courtermain chaos, was shaken. She insisted on lockdown protocols at the estate, hired private security, and called in favors from old connections in Washington. This wasn't just a family emergency anymore. It was a Corinthos crisis. And when the Corinthos family is in crisis, the entire city bleeds. What had begun as a series of carefully calculated power moves, Tracy's manipulation, Michael's custody war, Nina's fall from grace, had now spiraled into madness. Daisy's kidnapping was the final straw. The one act that pulled the mask off every player in town and revealed the rot beneath the surface. Nothing was stable. No alliance was safe. And the only rule left was survival. Port Charles was on fire, and no one knew who would burn next. What should have been a day of renewal, hope, and healing spiraled into one of the darkest hours Port Charles had seen in years. The sun rose softly that morning, casting golden light over the Corinthos estate as friends and family gathered in anticipation of Daisy's christening. It was more than a religious ritual. For Sasha, it was symbolic, a declaration that she had survived, that through all the grief, betrayal, and destruction that had followed her like a shadow since losing Brando and Liam, she had finally stepped into the light again. Holding Daisy in her arms, dressed in a delicate white gown sewn by Monica herself, Sasha felt, if only for a fleeting moment, whole again. The chapel was filled with smiles, music, and the comforting presence of those who had stood by her through the fire. But beneath that peace, something far more sinister was stirring. Something that no one, least of all Sasha, could have imagined would return to haunt them on the very day meant to bring protection and peace to her child. Unbeknownst to those inside the chapel, a figure lurked just beyond the garden hedges, eyes locked on the child at the center of the ceremony. Gladys had returned to Port Charles, not in shame or sorrow, but in silence and vengeance. She had watched from afar as Sasha rebuilt everything she had once destroyed, her sanity, her finances, her motherhood. And where others saw strength, Gladys saw opportunity. She saw the baby not as a gift, but as a commodity. A means to an end. A living, breathing price tag with a Corinthos legacy and courtermain blood. Gladys's debts had spiraled far beyond what anyone knew, and her old tricks no longer worked. There were no more doctors to manipulate, no guardianship papers to forge, and no allies left to bribe. But there was still Sasha. There was still Daisy. And there was still one play left, a bold, dangerous, unforgivable one. As the ceremony began, Gladys waited. She had slipped past the outer perimeter hours earlier, wearing a long black coat and a wide-brimmed hat, sunglasses masking her identity. She had studied the layout, memorized the exits. and timed everything with the cold precision of someone who had nothing left to lose. The moment the priest anointed Daisy's forehead and the congregation burst into gentle applause, she moved. Slipping through the side entrance, she weaved between the shadows of floral arrangements and linen-draped tables, her eyes never leaving the stroller parked just outside the side door. In a matter of seconds, the child was in her arms. One glance to make sure no one was watching. One breath. One step. And she was gone. What came next was not silence, it was hysteria. Sasha's scream was not just of terror, but of soul-shattering heartbreak. She dropped to her knees at the altar, clutching the space where Daisy had just been. Her sobs rising into the vaulted ceilings like a prayer no one could answer. Michael was the first to move, racing outside in all directions, calling her name. Sonny froze. Then stormed toward the cars, barking orders into his phone, already mobilizing his network of men, locking down the city, initiating the kind of search usually reserved for fugitives and traitors. Carly stood in shock, holding the christening candle that continued to burn as if mocking them all. Even Brooke and Nina were motionless, unable to process what had just happened in the sacred space meant for salvation. Then came the message. A single image, sent to Sonny's phone. It was Daisy, cradled in someone's lap. Eyes red from crying, the blanket Sasha had wrapped her in earlier now stained and rumpled. No words. No demands. Just proof. Proof that the unthinkable had happened. That Gladys had dared not only to return but to strike at the very heart of the Corinthos family. And in doing so, she hadn't just broken Sasha, she had triggered a chain reaction that no one could stop. Sonny's fury was unlike anything Port Charles had ever seen. This wasn't about strategy anymore. It wasn't about family politics or past betrayals. This was war. Gladys had taken something sacred, on a day meant to cleanse and bless, and turned it into a battlefield. She had drawn blood from a wound that had only just begun to heal. And Sonny, for all his power, couldn't stop the tremble in his hands as he stared at that photo. Knowing he had allowed this woman to live once, and that mercy had now cost him everything. Back at the chapel, Sasha could barely breathe. Her chest felt caved in. Her voice shredded from screaming Daisy's name over and over, as if somehow sheer willpower could summon her back. She was surrounded by people, but utterly alone. Nina tried to hold her. To whisper that they would find her, that this nightmare wouldn't last. But Sasha didn't believe it. She had known this pain before, the empty arms, the guilt, the helplessness. And now, she was drowning in it again. Michael, meanwhile, had snapped into action. He was already on the phone with tech teams, tracking any signals that might lead to Daisy's location. He'd seen what this kind of trauma had done to Willow, and he would not watch it happen again to another woman he loved. Even Dex and Joss had left the chapel, joining the search. Knowing that every second counted. The estate's gates were closed. No one in or out. Surveillance footage was being reviewed. But Gladys was clever, and she had planned this for months. She knew how to vanish. She knew how to hide. But what she hadn't planned for was the storm she had just unleashed. The entire town was now in a state of emergency. News of the kidnapping spread like wildfire. Reporters hovered outside the gates. Laura had already issued a public statement, urging calm, though her own face was pale with disbelief. Curtis arrived within the hour, offering manpower. Drew showed up too, clearly rattled, but his presence only added tension as Michael ordered him to stay away from Sasha entirely. Even Tracy, cold and calculating as always, was shaken. This, she muttered under her breath, wasn't part of anyone's plan. Because this was no longer about family feuds or custody battles. This was about a baby. An innocent life. Stolen in the moment she was supposed to be protected. And now, every minute that passed felt like an eternity. Gladys, wherever she was, believed she could hold Daisy for ransom. That Sonny and Michael would pay her off to get the child back, and that she could disappear into some foreign paradise, rich and forgotten. But what she failed to understand was that this wasn't just any baby. This was Daisy. Sasha's redemption. Sonny's blood. Michael's daughter. And they would burn down every corner of Port Charles to bring her home. The crisis had reached its boiling point. A baptism turned battlefield. A family on the edge. And a town holding its breath. Waiting to see whether justice would prevail, or whether Daisy would be lost forever to a woman who had never learned the meaning of love, only the price of power. Sonny had faced betrayal before. He had stared into the eyes of enemies, buried friends turned foes, and carried the weight of unspeakable losses on his shoulders for years. But what he saw now, what played out in silence across the flickering screen in front of him, wasn't just another betrayal. It was an act of war. A violation so intimate, so unforgivable, that it fractured something deep inside him. The footage showed no violence, no sound, no screams, just the cold efficiency of a woman who once pretended to be family. Slipping through sacred ground like a shadow, lifting Daisy from her stroller as if she belonged to her, and disappearing into the dark with terrifying ease. Gladys hadn't just crossed a line, she'd obliterated it. And in that moment, Sonny felt it, the world shifting around him, the balance tilting not just away from control, but into madness. This wasn't just another crisis to contain. It was a revelation. A warning. A transformation. The delicate equilibrium he had tried to maintain was gone, shattered by a woman he had once spared. Gladys had returned to Port Charles not with regret, but with audacity, and in doing so, she had triggered something uncontrollable, a chain reaction of adjustments, emotional ruptures, and terrifying escalation. And now, Sonny saw it all. He saw how everything was spiraling, Sasha's trauma exploding anew like a wound torn open. Michael veering into ruthless territory he might never come back from, Nina pacing in quiet dread of what Sonny would do next, and Carly, silent for once. Sensing that the man before her was no longer her ex-husband but a version of Sonny that hadn't emerged in years. It was the part of him he had buried, the part that didn't ask questions. Didn't seek justice, didn't offer mercy. It was the part of him born in back alleys, raised by violence, forged in betrayal. And now, it was awake. Because Gladys had committed the one sin Sonny could never overlook, she had made his family bleed. This wasn't just about a baby. This was about power, about ownership of consequence. About reminding the world what happens when you steal from Sonny Corinthos and think you'll get away with it. There had been many dangerous changes sweeping Port Charles lately. Tracy's political chess game, Michael's descent into vengeance, Drew's unraveling morality, but Sonny saw this one for what it was. A declaration of war, made by someone too stupid to realize she had become a target the moment she touched what wasn't hers. The dangerous thing wasn't just that Gladys had returned. It was that she believed she could manipulate the storm she'd walked into, that she could set the rules of engagement. But the truth was far darker. There were no rules anymore. Sonny was no longer trying to manage a crisis, he was becoming the crisis. And no one, not even his closest allies, knew just how far he would go this time. Because this wasn't about reclaiming order. It was about obliterating the threat before it breathed again. As he stood there in the silence of his private office, fists clenched at his sides, heart thudding with deadly precision, Sonny made a silent vow, he would find Daisy, and when he did, Gladys wouldn't just regret what she'd done, she'd regret every breath she ever took after it. The world had shifted, and so had Sonny. He was no longer the man who forgave. He was now the reckoning Gladys never saw coming. And nothing, not law, not family, not even blood, would protect her from what was coming next. There was a time when Sonny's protection came with a warning, an unspoken understanding that standing beneath his shadow came at a cost. That safety offered by his name meant entering a world governed by loyalty, silence, and calculated force. But those rules, once stable and familiar, were now being rewritten. In the aftermath of Daisy's kidnapping, as the echo of Sasha's cries still haunted the walls of the Corinthos estate, Sonny's protection had evolved into something far more absolute. Far more terrifying, and far more precise. It wasn't just defense, it was dominion. A total lockdown on every front. Sasha and Michael were no longer just members of his family, they were his mission. His responsibility. His obsession. And in a world teetering on the brink of collapse, they were now under the umbrella of a man who had stopped hoping for peace and started preparing for war. From the outside, it may have looked like overreaction, a grieving mother wrapped in private security, a son guarded like a head of state, but those close enough to feel the shift knew better. This wasn't about paranoia. This was about control. A new adjustment had taken root in Sonny's soul, a recalibration so profound that it changed not only how he viewed threats, but how he neutralized them. He had learned too late what mercy toward Gladys had cost him. And now he wasn't willing to pay that price again. Every movement around Sasha and Michael became calculated. Their home routines altered. Access points modified. Private guards vetted, replaced, upgraded. Sonny replaced Sasha's entire security team overnight, not because they had failed, but because they hadn't seen her coming. That fact alone had eaten at him. He had trusted too many systems. Too many people. And in the chaos of trying to build peace, he had allowed weakness to seep into the cracks of his empire. Now those cracks were being sealed with fire. No more assumptions. No more compassion. Only strategy. Only force. The Corinthos estate became a fortress again, motion detectors embedded in the gardens, retina scanners replacing keypads. Encrypted lines routed through off-grid servers. Sasha didn't even know half of what had changed around her because Sonny had arranged it to happen while she slept. Curled up on a couch with Daisy's blanket in her hands and no child to hold. Michael, ever independent and headstrong, had pushed back at first, questioning the new protocols. The way his own father seemed to be pulling him back into a world he had tried to rise above, but even Michael couldn't deny the fear in Sasha's eyes or the cold-blooded logic in Sonny's voice. If you want her back, Sonny had said, then everything changes. Now. And it did. What followed was a systemic lockdown unlike anything Port Charles had seen since the days of mob wars. But this time, it wasn't external cartels or rival families trying to destroy the Corinthos name, it was someone from inside, someone once welcomed at their table. And that betrayal rewrote everything. Gladys's actions didn't just trigger an emotional breakdown in Sasha or a protective instinct in Sonny, they sparked a broader realignment across the power map of the city. Tracy, long content to play her political games from the sidelines, began to reevaluate her allegiances. Carly, shaken by Sonny's renewed intensity, quietly reached out to allies she hadn't spoken to in years. Even Ava, never fully out of Sonny's orbit, began to sense that the man who had once made room for diplomacy was now returning to his original form, and perhaps something even darker. Because this wasn't just a reawakening. It was an evolution. Sonny didn't speak often during those first few days, but when he did, people listened. His orders were not barked, they were whispered. Measured, and terrifyingly clear. He wasn't looking for Gladys anymore. He was preparing for her elimination. He didn't care about ransom demands. He didn't want negotiations. He didn't even want answers. He wanted one thing, Daisy back in Sasha's arms and the threat buried so deep that no one would ever dare rise again. And the city responded. His allies closed ranks. Surveillance cameras were combed frame by frame. Underground contacts were mobilized. Ships were searched. Airports were watched. Every corner of the state tightened. And still, Sonny didn't rest. Because while others were trying to build cases, follow procedures, and maintain image, Sonny was busy building consequences. For Sasha, the world around her had gone silent. Grief lived in her skin now, bone deep, raw, relentless. There were moments she couldn't breathe, let alone speak. There were nights when she paced the floor for hours. Unable to stop hearing Daisy's cry in her mind. And through it all, Sonny was there, not with comfort, but with presence. A silent wall between her and the world. No one got near her unless Sonny approved it. No one asked her questions unless he cleared it. She didn't have to think, didn't have to protect herself, because he was doing it for her. She hated it. And she needed it. Because in her fractured state, Sasha knew one truth above all else: if anyone could bring Daisy home, it was the man currently transforming into a weapon before her very eyes. And Michael was changing too. Watching his father reclaim control with such terrifying ease brought back memories he thought he'd buried. He remembered the old Sonny. The one who moved like a phantom through his enemies, the one whose silence made men tremble. That man was back now. But older. Colder. And maybe even more dangerous. Michael felt himself being pulled in, drawn toward the force field Sonny was generating. He had built a life of business, respectability, and measured decisions. But with Daisy gone, none of that mattered. Now, all he wanted was justice. Or vengeance. Maybe both. And Sonny's way was suddenly the only way that made sense. They didn't say it out loud. But there was a moment, a quiet one in Sonny's office, with the blinds drawn and a single photo of Daisy between them, when Michael finally looked his father in the eye and nodded. No words. Just agreement. Alignment. And that was the moment Sonny knew. His son was with him now, not just as blood, but as fire. Outside their protective bubble. The rest of Port Charles was beginning to feel the aftershocks. Spencer and Trina cancelled a public appearance out of respect. Curtis rerouted half of his business dealings to avoid Corinthos properties. Even Jordan, still tied to the rules of law, began to walk more carefully around the estate. Everyone knew something had changed. A new energy. A new danger. The streets were quieter. The rumors louder. People began whispering the name Gladys again, but now it came with a look over the shoulder. Because if Sonny found her, there wouldn't be an arrest. There would be silence. Permanent and absolute. And yet, in the middle of this tactical lockdown, this emotional siege, there was still a seed of heartbreak that never stopped growing. Sonny could move mountains. He could break men with a phone call. But he couldn't stop the sound of Daisy's name on Sasha's lips when she whispered it in her sleep. He couldn't unsee the vacant stare Michael wore when he thought no one was looking. And for all his power, he couldn't shake the one truth that haunted him most, that he had allowed this to happen. That Gladys had done this under his watch. That his mercy had become a weapon used against the people he swore to protect. So now, there would be no more mercy. The protection he gave Sasha and Michael wasn't love, it was war. It was a shield made of steel and secrets, a fortress that would hold until the world was set right again. But what Sonny didn't yet realize, what no one realized, was that this new form of protection came with a cost of its own. Because once you rebuild your soul with vengeance, you don't always get it back. And as Port Charles watched Sonny tighten his grip on everything around him, the city began to understand something chilling. This wasn't just about finding a child. This was about rewriting the rules of power, permanently.